Welcome back, everybody. My name is Nick Crofts. I am a Co-op Party councillor in Liverpool, and I am president of the National Members Council at the Co-operative Group. This next session is a panel discussion exploring ideas for a more equal recovery. We are joined by thinkers and policymakers to consider how we can regrow the economy and rewrite the rules governing it to create something fairer than we had when we entered the crisis earlier in the year, and to do so in a way that really reflects our cooperative values and principles. First of all, we're going to hear from Anna Burley, who is the party's policy officer, who will introduce us briefly to the report that she authored over the summer called Owning the Future. The report focuses on how inequality is holding back our economic recovery and how widening ownership and rebuilding a more cooperative economy will narrow this inequality. We will then meet our panelists, and it's a tremendously heavyweight and august set of panelists who will each share their thoughts and ideas on rebuilding better from COVID before we take questions from the audience and we have a debate. Now, you can ask questions at any time through this debate if you're watching via the party's website. Just use the box on the right-hand side of the live stream to type your question in, although please do remember to share your name when you submit a question. You are more likely to have me spot your contribution if I can see who it has come from. So Anna, please tell us about the report.
Hi, thank you so much, Nick. And before I do, I want to say a congratulations on record for your very exciting new role at the Co-op Foundation. At the party, we're all very excited to be able to keep working with you in that capacity. And yes, I would like to talk about the report that we published over the summer, Owning the Future, that we've called the conference after, and that provides some of the theme for our talks through the week. So we published this report because we think that as we slowly emerge from lockdown, that we find ourselves at a crossroad. We can either return to the unequal economy that characterised pre-COVID Britain, or we can create something better. And obviously, as cooperators, we feel passionately that we have a responsibility to create something better. But what we've also seen is that in the last few months, and the previous panel really highlighted this, that we respond to crisis with kindness and cooperation, and that communities, not corporations, have really led the way in doing this. So COVID-19 has revealed just how broken our economy is, and I'm sure our speakers coming up will be able to give us sort of a lot more august, as you put it, detail on how that has been the case. But you know, even before we entered this crisis, we had too many people struggling to put food on the table, which in the world's sixth richest economy, as was, it is unacceptable. And through this crisis, we've seen deaths in the most deprived areas of England have been more than double those of the least deprived. Workers that we rely on to take the greatest risks throughout this pandemic who've been on the front line, from nursing our sick to keeping buses moving. And in the co-op movement, we particularly celebrate our retail workers. They've taken home some of the lowest wages, not all the retail workers, but we see real problems where actually it's those people at the lowest end of the income scale who take some of the greatest risks through the crisis. So at the Co-op Party, we think that in part this inequality is a symptom of the narrow ownership in our economy. We see wealth and power resting in the hands of a very small number of investors, shareholders, executives, and we see that this creates a level of short-term decision-making, or corporate myopia, as I think that the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England put it. And what this means is they're not making those decisions to the wider benefit of workers, consumers, communities, and the environment. And what this means is we end up with a very unequal distribution of wealth, we have low productivity, and we have weak growth. And so if we're wanting to create that sort of V-shaped recovery we've been promised, weak growth and a structural problem in our economy isn't going to help us get there. So we believe that we need to widen ownership so that more workers, consumers, and communities can have a stake in the businesses that shape their lives and the wider economy. And critically, we see that economies with a greater percentage of cooperatively owned businesses are more equal, are more productive, and are more resilient. So we think that actually by growing our cooperative economy and widening ownership, creating that board transparency, creating better engagement in the way that business and communities work together, and sort of really embedding our cooperative values in the DNA of our economy will help us grow better, as well as creating something which is fairer for everyone who's taking part in it. So if you haven't had a look at the report, prop here, we've got lots and lots of ideas in here. Not all of them are finished things, and we rely on thinkers like our panelists, our cooperative politicians, people like Annalise Dodds, who we've heard from already today, to help shape these. And obviously hearing from members about your ideas and priorities will help us to shape those too. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back over.
Okay, splendid. A very useful introductory session for the report. I would like now to introduce our panelists. I'll introduce all three in one go, just to generate that sense of excitement about the august nature of the contributions that we have. We are joined by Dr. Wanda Wypowska. Wanda is the Executive Director of the Equality Trust, which is a national charity campaigning to reduce social and economic inequality. Wanda has over a decade of experience working in the trade union movement and is also a visiting research fellow at the University of York and an equalities advisor to the London Recovery Task Force. We'll then be joined by Professor Andre Velasco. Andre is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He was Chile's Minister of Finance between 2006 and 2010, when his work to save Chile's copper windfall and create a rainy day fund was internationally recognized. He stood as a presidential candidate in 2013. And then we'll be joined by Luke Murphy. Luke is from the IPPR and is head of the Environmental Justice Commission and is Associate Director for the Energy, Climate, Housing and Infrastructure team. Before his time at the IPPR, Luke worked for the Labour Party as a policy and political advisor for a Shadow Secretary of State and for a succession of shadow government ministers, leading their work on housing, local government and devolution. We could not have a better panel to discuss these questions. So if we give everybody 5 or 7 minutes to share their thinking, and then we'll open it up for questions and debate. So Wanda, let's take you first. The floor is yours.
Hi, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I'm not going to quite follow the rules, as you might expect from an activist. But what I'd like to do is to ground this debate in people, because I think all too often when we're talking about inequality, we're discussing which measures we should use, whether it's going up or down. And I think until we really finally get a grasp on how inequality affects people in their everyday lives, then we're not actually going to get the policy solutions that we need. So, you know, since the 1980s, we've had consistently high levels of income inequality in this country, and this has had a cumulative effect. It's eroded assets, it's eroded saving, it's eroded the housing stock, and it's eroded people's resilience and ability to cope with the next shock that hits the system. So although we're experiencing COVID now, and that's a huge shock to the system, people who are lower down the income scales and in the middle income scales have been increasingly experiencing smaller shocks over the last 40 years, and this has had a cumulative effect. This has obviously been compounded by the deep cuts to infrastructure, to public services that we've seen, and also to the power of trade unions to collectively bargain. The reason this is so important is because we know from the research that in countries with high levels of income inequality, we also have high levels of physical and mental ill health. We have higher levels of obesity, we have higher levels of drug and alcohol addiction, higher levels of incarceration, we have low levels of trust, which obviously has an impact on democracy, and we have lower levels of social mobility and of educational attainment. So I really want to widen out this debate to the effects on our social fabric, not just on the economic side, because if we really want to tackle inequality, it's not just the fiscal and economic measures we need to take. We need to recognize that we will be able to tackle a lot of the socially determined ills and the health inequalities that are so stark and that have been opened up even more by COVID and what's happened over the summer. We've also seen wealth accumulating. We've seen, you know, the Gini of wealth is about twice the size of income inequality, and that is huge. We've seen a hollowing out of the middle and the middle classes. And of course, that makes it far more difficult for social mobility and for people to move upwards. And we saw in the Forbes report just a couple of days ago that billionaires have increased their wealth and now to over 10 trillion. And in the Forbes report, it said that COVID has increased this, especially the drivers of tech in particular. So we're seeing this hoarding at the top, and we're seeing ever more assets, wealth, power. Let's not forget that money buys power, hoarded at the top. And that means the vested interests are all the more interested in keeping the system as it is, in not adapting. For all the talk of purposeful business and trying to change, we know that ever more power and assets and wealth and access to power is hoarded in an ever smaller number of hands. So I don't want us to underestimate the struggle that we have to get people and to get policymakers to understand that inequality is important. I think they know that inequality is really important and needs to be tackled. I mean, we've had the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, everybody saying that inequality provides the wrong type of economic growth and that it is harmful. But until we can really get those vested interests to, as turkeys would do, vote for Christmas and recognize the importance of tackling inequality across the board, then I'm afraid, we can have all the policy papers we need because we won't see any action. So one of the things I think is really recognizing those intersections, and those intersections have been brought into play in terms of health inequalities very starkly by COVID. We've seen that in the most deprived neighborhoods, we've had the worst outcomes. We cannot ignore the fact that there are Black and Asian and minoritized ethnic people at the forefront of this, either in caring professions or in jobs that require lots of interaction with the public. And so we know the communities that are being worst hit because they're the communities that are always the worst hit by any type of shock to the system. So first of all, we really have to make sure that those in power are recognizing and acknowledging the role of inequality, and that could be in local councils, that could be in government, rather than just focusing on poverty, because the focus on poverty, which is the sharp end of inequality, has not seen us take great steps forward. We have not been tackling poverty. We have more children in poverty now than we did, and that's set to rise to 5 million from 4 million. One of the things I would say is we need a comprehensive inequality reduction strategy across government that takes all of this into account. But we do have a lever that we can use, and that is the socio-economic duty, which is Section 1 of the Equality Act that was not brought into force, but is in the law, which says that every public body would have to take into account when in its policies and its policy making, the effects of those policies on those who are socio and economically disadvantaged and on inequality. This has been brought into effect in Scotland on the Fairer Scotland duty. It's coming into effect in Wales later on in the year. And we need this as a very basic part of the government's so-called levelling up agenda to be brought into force in the UK. So I'll leave it there because I think I'm out of time.
Okay, thank you, Wanda. Wonderfully thoughtful and provocative. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel and deal with these very important and urgent issues. I'm an economist, and we economists, almost by definition, are a little boring, so I'm going to be boring. I'm going to talk about the economy and the tremendous challenges that we're facing there. Let me begin by saying that the COVID crisis is unlike any other crisis we have ever lived through. I'm a macroeconomist by training, as you mentioned. I was born and raised and have done work in Chile, so I've been studying financial and economic crises around the world for the last 25 years. And of course, we've seen debt crisis, we've seen banking crises. A decade ago, we had the world financial crisis. But never before did we have a crisis in which government told workers, please do not work, and in which government told firms, please shut down, do not produce. And this is important not simply to underscore the size and novelty of the crisis. It is also important to emphasize, because traditional remedies will not do the job, because this is not a traditional crisis. And some of the things that we have always done, sort of, cutting interest rates, spending more money, are necessary, but may not be sufficient to get us out of the crisis. Second thing I want to say is that I think there's a lot of idle chatter about a V-shaped recovery. Of course, this is an alphabet soup, because some people are saying V, some people are saying U. Now the recent fashion is to say K, meaning some sectors are going up and some sectors are going down. But the bottom line is that the longer the recovery takes, the more lasting the consequences will be. And that may sound a little fluffy and a little abstract, so let me make it concrete. Once upon a time, maybe 3 or 4 months ago in the early summer, we were all hoping that the sanitary and health situation would be brought under control in, say, 3 months' time. So this would be a very severe but fairly short-lived squeeze. And that meant that we could reasonably hope that the guy who owns a restaurant or a pizzeria might have to close for 3 months. Government help in the shape of furlough schemes and cheap credit might allow the owner of that business to remain current, keep paying workers, or government would pay workers. He would have to pay rent, or maybe pay suppliers. But after 3 months, we would go back to business as usual. It's been 6 months now. It could be another 3 or 6 or 9 months. We do not know, until people are allowed back to lead lives like the lives we led before. And that means that many of those businesses are simply not going to make it, especially as government support begins to wind down in the last quarter of this year. And it is not simply an issue of bankruptcy. It is also an issue of what we economists like to call structural change in the economy. Consumption patterns are not going to go back to what they used to be. I work at the LSE, which is in central London, and every morning as I walk across Waterloo Bridge and enter the neighborhood where the LSE is, I am struck by the fact that half the coffee shops are closed. And many of those may never reopen again, simply because foot traffic on those streets is unlikely to recover for a very long time. The same is true of other kinds of hospitality, of the entertainment industry, of air transport, of bus transport across cities or countries. That is to say, there is going to be massive job destruction in every economy in the world, including the UK economy. We're not seeing that in the UK unemployment rate yet, because of course the furlough schemes and other schemes have kept a lot of people at least formally employed, and that's a good thing. But I think we have to be pretty certain that there's going to be massive job destruction as those sectors that are no longer being, that will no longer be what they used to be, begin to unwind. And of course, job creation in other sectors will rise. But something we know from previous crises is that job destruction is very swift, job creation is very slow. And in the middle, I think we all have to be prepared for a period of fairly high and fairly persistent unemployment. And all the issues that the previous speaker was underscoring, of not just poverty, but inequality, are going to become much, much sharper. And in most countries, the current debate is not quite taking this into account yet. The third thing that I want to say is that not only are old inequalities still around, but new inequalities are going to come into being. And the main inequality is going to be between those of us who are lucky enough to be doing exactly what we're doing now. That is to say, we are at home and we are deploying our skills as professionals. And many, many people are in this position. I was reading an article yesterday which suggests that over the last quarter in the US, something like 40% of GDP was produced from people's homes. And that is the good news. The bad news is that the economy is increasingly going to be split between those of us lucky enough to be able to do our work from home and the majority of people who cannot, because the delivery worker or the health worker or the person who works behind the counter at a store or a shop or a supermarket or a shopping mall, those jobs cannot be done over Zoom and over Teams. Add to that the factor that I mentioned earlier. Many of the low-paying jobs that have to be done face-to-face are also low-paying jobs that are going to be in less demand, because as professionals and white-collar workers stay away from city centers, restaurants and shops and pubs and bars are going to have less activity. They will shed employees. So in the cold and ugly language of economics, demand for low-skilled labor is going to go down. This means that wages in that sector probably will not rise, and this will compound and deepen existing inequalities. I think I'm painting a fairly gloomy picture of the labor market going forward, but it is the most likely picture to emerge, and I think we have to be aware of this. The last thing I want to say is that rich countries like the UK or the US or most European countries have been lucky enough to have the fiscal space and the monetary space to launch very aggressive anti-crisis programs. We can always argue whether they've been aggressive or not, or sufficiently aggressive. Maybe a bit more could have been done. But the fact is that there's another division, and this time it is an international division between countries that can do that. You know, the UK, when all is said and done, will have spent maybe 10 or 11% of GDP on extraordinary anti-crisis measures. Middle-income countries in the world and low-income countries of the world have not been able to do that. As I heard a colleague say the other day, rich countries like the UK have done whatever it takes to keep the economy afloat. People in other countries and governments in low-income countries have done whatever they can afford. So there's going to be growing international inequality rising as well from this very deep gap between countries that have the fiscal and monetary space to do the kinds of things that, say, the US, the UK, or France are doing, and countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America have not been able to do. And we should remember, of course, that because interest rates in the world are low, we are living in a period, during which these extraordinary measures are possible. And I think certainly we should think twice before withdrawing support. I was at a call the other day with the managing director of the IMF, which historically was known for being conservative when it came to fiscal affairs. Even the IMF nowadays is saying, please do not withdraw measures, go easy on the lifting of some of the fiscal emergency measures because they're going to be needed for a very long time. And the only question that lingers there, of course, is how long are we able to keep these measures in place without fiscal issues becoming an issue? Public debt in the UK is 100% of GDP. Public debt in the US is 100% of GDP. And I think over the short run, it is a good thing that we can keep moving in that direction. But as an economist who's been studying crisis for 25 years or more, I know that you don't see the crisis coming until it hits you in the nose. So even those of us who are in favor of progressive policies and who are in favor of aggressive Keynesian stimulus of the economy, we have to begin thinking, not for this quarter, not for this year, not for next year, but down the road, exactly how the fiscal situation is brought under control, because these are exceptional measures, these are temporary measures. They are unlikely to be permanent. Bottom line, I think we have a lot of work to do, because the recovery that is being promised is not going to happen as quickly as it is being promised. Very, very difficult times ahead for the labor market. Some of the old inequalities will remain in place. Some new, deep and sharp inequalities will arise. And we're going to need a wholly different and wholly creative and novel policy approach to deal with those. Otherwise, many countries, including rich countries like the UK, are going to find themselves in a very, very difficult situation indeed. I've probably gone on for too long, so let me stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Andre. I can't imagine what made you think that sounded a gloomy prognosis for the labour market or for the national or international economy. Luke, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks very much for having me. As Nick said, I'm Luke Murphy. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Public Policy Research. I suppose I wanted to start with just echoing what the previous speakers have said about recognising that the issues around inequality clearly did not arise with this crisis. The symptoms, that they're effectively symptoms of deep structural problems with the UK economy, which long predate the pandemic. And as the other speakers have said, this is prevalent we see this in wages and work. The prevalence of low and insecure pay means that a majority of people before this crisis that were living in poverty were actually in working households. And then there's unequally distributed rewards as well. As Wanda highlighted, over the last 40 years, only 10% of the national income growth that we've seen has gone to the bottom half of the income distribution, while almost 2/5 went to the richest 10%. The UK is the 5th most unequal country in Europe in terms of income, and inequality of wealth is even greater. The top 10% of households own more wealth than the bottom 80%. And that's not to mention the vast intergenerational inequalities we're seeing, not least in property, the geographic disparities that we see. The UK is Europe's most geographically unbalanced economy, as well as being one of the most centralised political systems in the developed world, and those two things are not a coincidence. And also the racial inequalities that have become so apparent as a result of COVID, but have been around for many years, from education to health and wealth too. And then, as the other speakers have said, the impact of COVID-19 on household incomes so far has been highly unequal. So as well as the health inequalities that we've seen those on the lowest incomes hit hardest. We've seen educational inequalities alike. The educational attainment gap was already growing again, unfortunately, before this crisis, and we're only going to see this crisis exacerbate that too. And our IPPR research has predicted that 1.8 million jobs could be lost, even with the government's new scheme, because it's not providing adequate support to the workers. So yeah, I would agree with Andres about the oncoming jobs crisis if more intervention isn't done. But given that this session's fundamentally about owning the future, I wanted to focus a bit on what we think at IPPR can actually be done. And I think we share much in common with the analysis that Anna set out earlier from the Co-operative Party's report. And I think, first of all, it's important to say that, in our view, if we want to create a more just economic settlement coming out of this crisis, we've got to confront the imbalances of wealth and power with long-term structural solutions. Economic justice needs to be hardwired into the way the economy works. We can't come out of this crisis and think we can address it simply by redistributing through the tax and benefit system. Only structural reform will do. It needs to be tackled at source in the structures of the economy in which they arise. So this includes the labour market and in wage bargaining. It means in the ownership of capital and wealth, something that was obviously a big focus of the report that Anna mentioned at the beginning. It includes the governance of firms, the operation of the financial system, and also the rules that govern markets. Economic justice cannot be an afterthought. It must be fundamentally built into the economy. So there's three broad solutions, or three key tenets we're arguing at IPPR that need to be taken forward as we seek to build back better, in the words of the government, which is more rhetoric than reality at the moment. First, by locking in a new economic model that is hardwired for social, economic and climate justice. Secondly, by paying for the crisis fairly. And thirdly, through delivering a new social contract. So firstly, what does locking in a new economic model hardwired for social, economic and climate justice look like? Firstly, and you might expect this from someone who's head of an Environmental Justice Commission, it's got to fundamentally be a green recovery. The inequalities that could arise if we allow the climate and nature crises to run out of control could make COVID look like a picnic. It's a huge crisis. It's not a surprise. It's not a surprise. We know it's coming, and a green recovery must be a key part of as we seek to kind of lock in a new economic model post this crisis. That means long-term investments in order to reshape the economy to drive towards net zero and restore nature. And that includes not just jobs in terms of housing retrofit, but recognising the different forms of work that can take part of a low carbon economy, including in social care and investment in health too. The second part of that is also recognising that, you know, the recovery should be about economic justice, inclusion and well-being. We should reject a growth at all costs approach. We should be, or any job approach following this crisis. We should need to focus on narrowing inequalities, reducing poverty and promoting well-being. And that fundamentally means rejecting outdated metrics around GDP and focusing on a much wider basket of what actually it means to be human, really, and a much wider basket of metrics focusing on people's well-being. We've seen countries like New Zealand and to a certain extent Scotland take that approach as well. It also means structural economic reform, delivering changes in ownership and power structures as well to drive a fairer and stronger economy. So things like formal social partnership structures that bring together trade unions, civil society, working with government to actually plan out, for instance, a just transition for the climate and nature crisis, actually working together as a society, much as we've seen, I think as a result of COVID, you've seen unusually the head of the CBI and the head of the Trade Union Congress working together in a way which they haven't before. We need much more of that kind of social partnership working at all levels of society. Secondly, paying for the crisis fairly. That means rejecting austerity. We must learn from the mistakes of the past and invest in services and social security. It will mean, in the medium term, new progressive tax reform. We should be taxing wealth at the same level as income. It is absolutely wrong that those who dominate the ownership of capital see a lower level of taxation than those who see the vast majority of us, who see the vast majority of their income come through work. We also need to focus on who has lost the least and who should pay the most. We need to understand who's lost the least through the crisis, both in the immediate term and longer term, as the previous speakers have outlined, so that as we come through this, we make sure that those who've lost the least are those that now pay the most on the other side. And thirdly, it's about delivering that new social contract. We need new forms of risk pooling. We need to recognise that our social security system is not fit for purpose. This crisis has exposed that. We need a much stronger and greater and more expansive safety net for those on the lowest incomes, and make sure that we redistribute risk away from those who can least bear it to those who can bear it with the least difficulty. I've seen too much of a shift of risk to individuals, and particularly those on the low incomes, over the last 30 years. And lastly, just two final points. We need resilient, decentralized services. We can't continue with this over-centralized system that, as we've seen, both in politics, in power and in public services, it is not adequate to the task. We've seen that in the public health response, and that goes for economic powers, housing, etc. We need to devolve power down to the local level. And finally, we need to have an open society built on social cohesion, trust and shared power. We've got to have an aim to build cohesion and trust across the country, and a big part of that, as I've said, is about devolving power to the local and regional level to allow local communities to drive social renewal. And obviously a big part of that, as Anna said at the very beginning, is around cooperative ownership structures and community ownership, so people have a real stake in the future and this new economy, which hopefully we can design together. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thanks, everyone. We've heard a fascinating description of the macroeconomic precipice on which the global economy stands, and the very long pathway, if indeed there is a pathway, out of the other side. We've heard of the very pernicious effects that these inequalities and structural problems are having on real people and real people's lives. And we've heard the beginnings of an agenda that might lead to structural change, as Luke set out, that would enable us to build back better from this calamity that has befallen us. So do keep the questions coming in. They're beginning to arrive now. As cooperators, we're obviously very interested in the idea of a more cooperative future, being able to tackle some of the issues that we've heard. We've seen that in economies that are characterized by a greater cooperative sector, that the impact of inequality, and indeed the impact of the pandemic, has been reduced. Productivity higher in many of those countries that have that larger cooperative sector. So my first question to the panel is, how could we begin to cooperatize the UK economy, and what sort of impact might that have, both in policy terms and on real people, if we were able to do it? Who'd like to go first? Vonda, would you like to go first?
Well, I mean, I think it's something that we've seen in practice really works well at all levels of the scale. So, you know, if we, as we quite typically do, take something like Mondragon as an example, where we have CEO pay ratios of about, I think it was 3-to-1. They got a bit excited when it got up to 3-to-1, because that was quite outrageous for a cooperative. But what we see with a system like that is taking into account the human. And so, you know, my understanding of how that works is that people are able to move from job to job, are able to see how they want to work, what suits them. And so there's this ability to be able to try different jobs, see what suits you, move around the organization as well, because it's so much more than just a workplace. It is about the community. It is about the values. And I think, you know, obviously that has a much higher impact on people's well-being on a day-to-day level if they have that level of security as well. So, you know, it's the absolute opposite of our platform gig economy, where, you know, people are widgets to be rearranged, and there's no actual thought about them, their lives, their caring duties, or their well-being. So, I mean, I think the impact of having more cooperatives in the UK, for example, could be absolutely transformative on a personal level, but I think also on an economic level, because I think it shows that in practice this works, and that, as you said, there's higher levels of productivity. The organisations themselves are far more resilient economically. I think one of the things we also need to do is to broaden that range. So to recognise as well that communities are doing this by themselves and not actually, you know, necessarily being part of the wider cooperative movement. So, you know, where back in the day we would have Black communities pooling their resources, pooling their money in terms of credit unions or informal savings organisations like that. So I think we have to have a wider interpretation of what a cooperative movement is as well, and seek to make it far more inclusive.
Okay, thank you. Luke and then Andre.
Thanks very much. I mean, I'd love to largely agree that about the positive action that the kind of individual cooperatives can have, and if we were to see more cooperatives in practice in the UK. But I think it's in a way it's more than that. It is about actually the cooperative spirit and a kind of culture of cooperation, which fundamentally I think, you know, COVID has been almost the ultimate test of that. And at a local level, I think that's where you've seen the leadership in terms of the collective action, the community spirit, that kind of cooperative spirit that you've seen has been bottom up. It's been very much bottom up, but we've not seen it come from the very top of government for probably the best part of 30, 40 years, because it's you know, we have an over centralized political system that doesn't and an economic system that favors the individual, and that permeates our entire economy. And we just did a report at IPPR on looking at the, you know, how prepared our current political system is for climate change. And we've argued, you know, it's the greatest collective action problem that we could possibly face in the climate and nature crisis, bigger than COVID, even though we won't see it in such an immediate way. and to tackle that, to overcome or to build back better from COVID, and to prepare for the climate and nature crisis, which is already upon us. We do need a big effort to kind of grow that kind of cooperative and community-minded spirit, and to build greater trust in collective action, because I think trust in the body politic, in government, has been at all-time lows prior to this crisis. We saw it increase, but that will require a kind of a response from the government, from political parties and leadership, that we should devolve power and trust collective action. So I do think it's individual cooperatives, yes, but I think it's about a wider culture change that we need from top to bottom, from politics to the economy as well.
How is it that we can leverage our values outside the sector, wield influence outside the sector? Andre.
There we go. Thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. Let me add a couple of thoughts that might be complementary to the things that have been said before. Cooperatives also have the virtue that they can bring people together, and they can bring small businesses together. As many traditional businesses in the service sector disappear, there is the risk that the gig economy, with all the things about the gig economy that we do not like, will grow, and that many of the jobs that economy will create will be jobs without permanent contracts, without stability, without benefits. Put it this way, you read The Economist this week, it says, well, yes, lots of jobs in restaurants will go away, but lots of jobs as Uber drivers or delivery people for Amazon will rise. And I think that we all love technology, but we're all aware of the difficulties associated with those jobs that are transitory, with no contracts and no benefits. So I think that the fascinating question is whether small businesses can enter that space, associating themselves with one another, because clearly, you have to be big to compete in that space. You cannot have one car and hope to fight Uber, but if you have some scale, maybe at least at a local level, in a neighborhood or in a town, you can. So the economist in me wants to say that cooperatives also can provide scale, and scale can make small businesses competitive. And of course, they have the advantages that several people mentioned, that they're better employers, that they tend to provide a more equitable pay scale, and they tend to provide more stable jobs with more benefits. And I think that's going to be the big dividing line as we go forward. There is the risk that one of the unexpected side effects of COVID is that the gig economy, which is pretty big and pretty unsettling in many dimensions already, will become simply out of control. And that the world will end up being divided among those of us who collect a paycheck at the end of a month and who have white-collar jobs and who can work over Zoom on the one hand, and then people who are doing gig jobs with no stability on the other. And so that's another version of the old hollowing out of the middle hypothesis. And I think cooperative structures can help provide that middle, which is fading away. And if it fades away entirely, the consequences, I think, will be pretty nasty indeed.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So we've had a question from a viewer called Phil, who observes that the economic rebound had essentially not properly recovered since the great crash of 2008. And he wonders what lessons there are from that crash of 2008, its impact on people, the policy responses that the government deployed at the time. Luke, it strikes me that your fair payments, which I read as a kind of a narrative that says abolish austerity, is a direct critique of the government response to 2008. What lessons do you think we can learn?
I think there's a number of lessons. First, austerity, I think, is certainly one of them, in terms of almost precisely the wrong response. I think as we've seen with COVID, you know, what austerity did, you know, in addition to having a massive impact on people's lives, increasing poverty and exacerbating inequality, it also left us fundamentally unprepared for the onset of COVID-19 and the crisis. So I think certainly, as you know, as a policy response, austerity was, you know, was fundamentally flawed. I think the biggest mistake, probably following the crash, is that while some financial reforms were introduced, I think it goes back to what I said kind of in my opening remarks, which is we didn't attempt to do that, you know, to rewrite the rules, in the words of the Co-op report that Anna described earlier, or hardwire the economy for economic justice. We didn't look to fundamentally change the structure of the UK economy. We didn't attempt to you know, tackle our productivity crisis, the fact that we invest so much less in research and development, in infrastructure than similar countries and many of our competitors. So we failed to undertake that fundamental reform. And then, in addition to austerity, and it kind of goes back to that point I made earlier as well about, you know, who's lost the least out of this crisis. We didn't step back from the financial crisis and look at who had lost the least and who should pay the most. And we actually ended up piling the burden on those who had lost the most and could afford it least. And we need the kind of opposite response now. So I think it's really about stepping back and being clear that, you know, we need a fundamental rewriting of the rules of the economy. And I think secondly, it was also just one last point, was that it was also a big missed opportunity to kind of usher in a real green recovery as well. You know, that was a really big opportunity there that we missed. There was some green stimulus, and that can't happen again. And I think we're seeing a different narrative and a different story being told now, and certainly people many politicians at all levels buying into the idea of a green recovery following this crisis. But that's got to be underpinned by real policy, and we've got to move beyond just the kind of high-level language. We now need the practical strategies and investment to deliver a real green and fair recovery from this crisis.
Thank you. Wanda, what are your thoughts about the lessons that we can learn from 2008?
Well, I think the lesson that's learned, in a sense, is that we know who the people are who are going to suffer. We know that it's digging into the resilience, the assets, you know, this it goes back to that cumulative effect, isn't it? Because if you keep on pushing down, in effect, wages, if you keep on pushing down wages in a sense that people aren't able to rely on a 35-hour week or a 40-hour week of work, if you continue to cut services, which means that the health of the population is at risk, with all of the costs that factors into the NHS and to other services, if you continue to strip the services and the quality of life, then, you know, when something like COVID comes along, and as I said before, it doesn't have to be COVID, it just happens to be COVID at the moment. There are all these multiple shocks to the economy and to people's lives. Then you have to think about actually how much it's going to cost to try and build back better, or even build back, because we're not building back to where we were. You know, wages were only just approaching the levels of pre 2008, and we knew before COVID that we were sliding into worse economic conditions even before COVID hit. So, you know, I don't feel very confident that lessons have been learned, because it's the vested interests in the top that are still going to be fine no matter what happens. You know, those with the most ability to resist these shocks are the people in power. And so they, again, you know, I would say they have no vested interest in actually supporting people at the bottom, or even people in the middle at the moment. And I think what's interesting is with the last election, is that to see how those red wall conservatives are going to jump, and to see those huge differences now between what's happening in the northwest and the northeast and what's happening in the south in terms of COVID, and to see what effect that potentially could have on policy.
Okay, thank you. Andre, I'm sure you made a detailed study of the 2008 economic disaster. What are your most important reflections around the lessons that we can learn and take forward into this situation?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time dealing with the crisis, and I've spent a lot of time since studying the crisis. Lots of lessons, but let me mention three. One is that when something as big as the world financial crisis of a decade ago happens, or COVID today, we're all tempted to say at panels like this, well, the crisis will have lasting consequences, life will never be the same, things will inevitably change. But then sometimes they don't change. So it is not automatic that after a big shakedown, things change, and it is even much less automatic that they change for the better. And there are lots of things, some were mentioned already. For instance, the whole issue of productivity and R&D spending and diversification of the economy, which we all assume, Luke mentioned this, no, we all assumed that would happen. Well, it didn't happen. So my first thought is that crises are nasty. They do shake up society and the economy, but change is not automatic. Second thing I want to say is that the narrative that emerges from the crisis is almost as important as the policies. I think one could make the case that, purely on macroeconomic grounds, on technical grounds, the fact that, government was able, in the early days of the crisis, of course, then came austerity under the Tories, but in the early days of the crisis, I'm thinking, Gordon Brown days, the UK and the US under Obama were able to do a fairly aggressive fiscal counter-cyclical policy. Interest rates were cut. There was a pretty strong stance. So in a technical point of view, the response to the crisis was not so bad. But narratives politically are not simply built on technicalities. They're built on a broader perception on whether people feel that they were treated fairly or unfairly. And in many countries of the world, middle-class people came, and working-class people came out of the crisis feeling, well, the banks got a bailout, no bankers went to jail, very few people were punished, and, I lost my home. And as a result, we got the kind of populism and the kind of pushback that gave us Brexit and gave us Donald Trump, among other things, right? So I think it is very, very key that not only that we should take adopt the policies, but that we should come out of this crisis ideally. And of course, this depends primarily on who's in power, but not only on them. That we're all in the same boat and we're all rowing in the same direction, because otherwise, the political fabric, which is pretty torn in many countries already, will get even worse. And a word on austerity, and here maybe I'll be a slightly contrarian. Clearly, austerity as practiced in the UK over the last few years was badly thought out and badly applied. But that does not mean that we people who care about welfare and who care about human beings and care about progressive policies should be entirely uninterested on what happens to public debt. Because many countries of the world have had big public debt crises. And in the end, when that happens, it is not the rich who suffer, it's the working class people and the poor who suffer, right? Because public services are cut, because pensions are cut, because too much money from the government is spent paying interest and not enough money is paid on public services. So I think not for 2020 or 21 or 22, but down the road, I think the question we all have to be asking is, if public debt is 100% of GDP, who the hell is going to pay the bill? And does that mean that the tax burden is going to have to rise? And if so, what kinds of taxes on what kinds of people? I think that is an issue that we have to begin thinking about, because clearly, making sure the public finance is healthy is not simply a matter for the City of London or for conservative politicians. It is also an issue for progressive politicians and progressive citizens to be thinking about. Again, it's not the issue for tomorrow, but it will be an issue down the road, and we have to start thinking about it soon.
Yes, absolutely. And the correct criticism of the Tory government austerity policy that we saw from 2010 onwards is that it didn't work. The level of debt went up and up and up as a result of the austerity policies, which absolutely plays into that.
Among other reasons, because the economy didn't grow very much, right?
Okay, good. So we've had the opportunity to think about the immediate crisis and the impacts of that. I want to give some thought now to medium and longer term trends that potentially can play into these very big questions of inequality. We've had a question from Duncan playing into productivity. Now, we know that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's nearly everything, as the economists like to say. To what extent does AI and robotics potentially have an impact, either for a helpful impact or an unhelpful impact, in respect of these and other technological questions, in respect of these very big questions that we're talking around inequality? Luke, would you like to go first? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think on automation, I think that one of the things that we've argued at IPPR is that it's kind of automation is there to be managed. Left unmanaged, it could quite easily exacerbate current inequalities. I think one of the other conclusions we came to is that, you know, automation as a trend, the predictions of it being a kind of job destroyer are actually quite you know, overblown and a little far-fetched. Actually, you're more likely to see automation change the structure of the economy, but also the type of work that we'll see in future. But I think a lot of it actually comes back to, I mean, again, a kind of fundamental cooperative agenda, which is about who owns the assets and who owns the capital. Whether it's through you know, the digital economy and you know, digital platforms, or automation in the physical economy. If we have an economy that fundamentally allows those who own capital, well, firstly, where capital is owned by a small and assets are owned by a small minority within the economy, or certainly a majority of it is, and we also allow them to get, you know, greater returns from their ownership of that than most people are able to go out with, you know, on that in terms of the income they get from day-to-day work. Goes back to that point what I was saying earlier about taxation rates and the fact that we tax wealth far lower than we do income. If you allow that to continue, then automation will fundamentally exacerbate these inequalities. But we can rewrite the rules, we can change it, and we, you know, if we extend ownership of capital and assets more broadly through the economy, through expanding, as you know, cooperatives, through community ownership, through public ownership, and we also have a fairer system that redistributes the benefits that come from that ownership, then automation need not be the kind of the job destroyer or driver inequality that people predict. So it all depends on how we manage it and the choices that we make, as with so many other trends. It depends on political leadership and policy choices.
Vonda, what are your thoughts about the balance between opportunity and challenge with these medium to long-term factors?
Well, I think as a historian originally, if we learn from what's happening at the moment, the Forbes report specifically said that COVID was driving the increase in billionaires' wealth, and in terms of the tech giants and those at that end. So we can see exactly what Luke's saying, that the concentration of that capital in such small hands, such few hands, is one of the key drivers of inequality. But my other concern also is going back to, you know, the very sort of well-worn argument around algorithms, how they're set, by whom they're set, the lack of diversity in that. We've seen that, you know, in terms of how the education system was absolutely torn apart over the summer in terms of, you know, the private schools getting far better results as opposed to to the state schools, but also in terms of ethnicity and race and gender and other protected characteristics. You know, we know that the algorithms are reacting in a predictable way, and every now and then we get a news article saying, you know, passport photos of Black people are not being recognised, or all sorts of things like that, because again, we're looking at who are the people creating the algorithms, and if they're just running on a particular history, and there's no adjustment, then this is becoming very scary. And to be honest, you know, we've been approached by a number of organizations saying, you know, they are using algorithms and AI to create greater equality. And, you know, I would have my doubts about that because of the, you know, the distribution of the labor market and who's in particular roles.
Thank you. Andre, I'm sure you've got thoughts about this. Productivity is not everything, but it's nearly everything.
Oh, absolutely. Two thoughts. I want to revisit a subject or a topic that Luke mentioned earlier, and I did too. For a highly advanced economy, the UK has experienced pretty low productivity growth. And that may be linked, you know, there's no one hypothesis that explains it. One explanation might be that unlike other industrial economies or advanced economies, a lot of the UK economic activity is very much in the service sector. And we know that, you know, most bits of the service sector, not all, tend to experience fairly slow productivity growth. So a big question is to what extent you know, we can reduce our dependence on a few sectors, particularly finance. I don't think the UK will go back to being an industrial power of the kind the UK was in the 19th century. I don't think, you know, we'll be filled up with mills spewing smoke again. Hope not. But there is a question about diversification, and there's a lingering question about what role, you know, active government policy can have in promoting that diversification. A second thought is that technological change is going to create jobs, but it is going to destroy jobs as well. And as a couple of the speakers mentioned already, we need not be fatalistic about the nature and direction of technological change, meaning, you know, these innovations don't simply drop from the sky. They're being driven by decisions being made by companies and people. There's an economist who I admire a lot, happens to be a friend, a guy called Danny Roderick, a professor at Harvard in the US, who's been writing very eloquently recently, saying that, well, we should have policies to make sure that instead of destroying jobs, technological innovation can create good jobs at good wages. This is not automatic. It is not easy. There will be labor-saving innovations inevitably, so this is not something that we can control 100%, but I think there is some room for that. Last but not least, I think automation will create jobs in the long run, but it will destroy lots of jobs in the short run. And we have to be thinking seriously about what kinds of policies, whether wage subsidies or others, that will enable those households whose main breadwinners are losing their jobs to survive, to do well, to, you know, put food on the table and educate kids. You know, I think there's a lot of room for experimenting with wage subsidies of different kinds. Wage subsidies may have to be used in conjunction with other tools like minimum wages to make sure that you know, the wage that people take home is in fact going up and not down. There's a room for being creative. I think we have to be non-ideological about this because different countries have different recipes and there's no one God-given ideal recipe. I think that we should put cliches aside and be creative about this, because otherwise we're going to find a lot of people without a job in the short run. I mean, a lot of the standard occupations that create a lot of jobs in modern societies are not going to be around 5 years from now. You know, the driverless car or bus 5 years ago seemed like something out of a movie. It's really around the corner. You know, when we all go to Sainsbury's and Tesco's nowadays, you know, we do our own checkout at the counter, right? The people behind the counter are very few and far between. That trend is going to generalize. So a lot of the traditional activities, whether as a checkout clerk or whether as a driver, are simply going to disappear. And we have to be very, very creative in coming up with answers, because that change is going to come much more quickly than most people are anticipating, and the consequences on employment and equality could be very, 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 very difficult.
Yes, thank you, Andre. I must challenge you, by the way, because nobody on this webinar shops at Sainsbury's. We all shop at the Co-op, obviously, the clue being in the name.
Yes. Let's say, yes, of course.
Of course. You must join. We've had a question from Marianne, which seems very appropriate to perhaps be the final question. If you each had to pick one policy change or one policy innovation that you think would have the biggest impact in making a change on this whole agenda that we've been discussing today, which one would be at the forefront? And we'll take Vonda first.
Okay, I'm beginning to dread hearing the words, I'll take Vanda first. You keep thinking, guys. It's really difficult, isn't it? Because the change that we want is so huge and so fundamental. It's very difficult to change structures by one policy. I would probably go for nationalisation as the biggest area, which I guess is happening a little bit by default, but not in the right way. I think it's the way you do it, not just what you do it, how you do it, what you do.
Okay, good, thank you. Andre.
Well, let me follow up on what I said just a minute ago. Jobs. Jobs are going to be destroyed by technology and by COVID. And we need to think of lots of policies. Wage subsidies that I mentioned already is one policy to preserve jobs. Governing technology to make sure that it creates jobs, doesn't destroy jobs, is part of the same package. But again, I would underline employment. It seems to me very, very urgent and strangely neglected sometimes in political discussions.
Okay, thank you. And Luke.
Well, since Wanda and Andres have taken ownership in jobs, which may very well have been two of the things I might have said. It sounds a bit boring, but actually, what we measure matters, and I would argue that from the environment to people's well-being, the overwhelming economic focus on GDP is actually deeply harmful, and we need to move to a well-being approach where we focus on both the outcomes for our environment and people. And if we have those different objectives and metrics and how we measure success in mind, that should help drive the kind of policies that we try and implement and succeed, and then hopefully deliver more positive and beneficial outcomes across the whole range of issues that we've discussed. So I'd say a focus on well-being.
Splendid. Well, that seems to be the perfect point at which to end this discussion. I think it has been absolutely fascinating in the context of setting the scene, surveying the circumstances that are prevailing at the macro level for economies, at the individual level for people, for families and for communities, and to have a proper and detailed discussion about the things that we might do to tackle it. As cooperators, we are never satisfied with the status quo. We are absolutely about owning the future. And I think this has been a really important part of that discussion. So it would be at this moment that I would invite our audience to show their appreciation with a round of applause to our guests. It'd be a bit weird for me to do that now, but if you all bang your desks at home, then we'll know, and our guests and panelists will feel your praise. So thanks very much to Vonda, to Andre, and to Luke. Ordinarily at this moment, I would be handing you over to Andy Burnham, who of course is the Metro Mayor of Greater Manchester. Unfortunately, Andy has had to step away from his commitment to appear live at the conference this afternoon. For completely understandable reasons, he is pending policy changes on COVID and lockdown restrictions in Greater Manchester. So I'm sure we'll all understand why he has to attend to that. So the next thing on the conference schedule will be the quiz and the awards, which I guess is later on this evening. So look forward to that. It's been a really interesting session. I hope that everybody will be well, and I trust that everybody will stay safe. Thank you very much.